When Richard Carter's eyes met the baby's, time seemed to stop. This wasn't just shock. This was heartbreak disguised as fear. The billionaire who never flinched in a boardroom suddenly couldn't breathe. The music faded, glasses stilled, even the chandeliers seemed to hold their light. Grace, shaking, holds the child close, tears streaming. The boy's hazel eyes, identical to Richard's, cut through the silence. For years, Grace had carried the secret alone. For years, she was called a liar. But in that moment, under the glitter of the richest man's party, the truth spoke louder than money. This wasn't about scandal. It was about a child who deserved to be seen, and a father who could no longer look away. Before we continue, please kindly tell us where you are watching from, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Nup Stories have an emotional story to engage your day. By subscribing, we can give you more lovely story. Richard Carter had never forgotten the smell of gasoline. It clung to his childhood like a second skin. The scent of his father's overalls, the small-town garage where he grew up, the rattle of tools against concrete. The Carters weren't poor enough to starve, but they were poor enough to notice. Dinner was beans and cornbread, heat was a privilege, and Christmas gifts often came in the form of used socks and second-hand jackets. From a young age, Richard understood that no one was coming to save him. If he wanted out of that dusty little town, he'd have to claw his way out. And he did. He was the boy who fixed neighbors' bicycles for $1. The teenager who worked double shifts at the gas station to buy his first suit. He was 19 when he walked into a bank for the first time, heart pounding, hands slick with sweat, and asked for a loan to buy a rundown repair shop. People laughed at him back then. They called him too young, too ambitious. But Richard Carter wasn't just ambitious. He was relentless. Within a decade, he didn't just own one shop, he owned 5. Then came real estate investments, tech startups, risky takeovers that either made him a fortune or nearly broke him. But every time he stumbled, he came back sharper, hungrier, more dangerous. By 45, Richard Carter was no longer a mechanic's son. He was a billionaire, a man whose name made headlines and whose handshake could make or break CEOs. But success does strange things to a man. Power doesn't just change what you own, it changes what you see when you look in the mirror. Somewhere along the way, Richard stopped seeing people as people. He saw assets, threats, leverage, and when you start thinking that way, rules stop mattering. The Richard Carter the world saw was perfect, the charming tycoon stepping off private jets, flashing his signature smile on magazine covers, hosting charity galas in tailored tuxedos. Beside him, always, was Evelyn. Elegant, poised, her diamonds glinting under ballroom chandeliers. The Carters looked untouchable, and maybe that's why no one noticed the small cracks beginning to form in their perfect world. While Richard's empire soared, Evelyn was left sitting alone at the far end of a 12-seat dining table. She had been there since the beginning, before the skyscrapers, before the private jet, but somewhere between the first deal and the billionth dollar, she'd lost her husband to his work, his ego, and perhaps other women. Evelyn wasn't naive. She had heard the whispers about Richard's charm not ending at the boardroom. She had seen the tabloid headlines pairing his name with actresses and models. She had learned to smile through them all, to keep the family name pristine, because that's what perfect wives do. But perfection has a way of suffocating you, and Evelyn was suffocating quietly. And then there was Grace. Grace was only 23, but she carried herself like someone twice her age. There was no time for youth in her life, not when every paycheck had to stretch far enough to feed her little brother and keep him in school. While Richard jetted across the world closing million-dollar deals, Grace scrubbed his marble floors and polished his silver until it gleamed. She didn't complain, she didn't gossip, she worked, because that's what women like Grace did, even when no one noticed. Her life was quiet, simple, and brutally consistent. Wake before dawn, catch the bus, clean for hours, go home to a tiny apartment with a nearly empty fridge, send money to her brother, sleep, repeat. Her only indulgence was a small photo taped above her bed, her brother smiling in his school uniform, and on her hardest days she whispered to that photo like a prayer, just a little longer. Just until he graduates. Grace had seen Richard 100 times but never really met him. To her, he was just another part of the house, like the grand staircase or the paintings on the wall. A presence, a shadow. But Grace noticed things. She noticed the way Richard's jaw tightened when a business call went badly, the way he loosened his tie and poured himself a drink afterward. She noticed the tension in his voice when Evelyn called from another wing of the house, the way his charm faded the moment the call ended. Richard never noticed her. at least not until one stormy night. That night, the house was quiet. The staff had gone home early because of the weather. The wind howled through the trees outside, rattling the windows. Grace stayed late, determined to finish polishing the last of the silver before leaving. She was bent over the dining table when she heard it, footsteps behind her. Slow, heavy, uneven. She turned and found Richard standing in the doorway, his hair damp, his shirt collar open, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He looked different. Not like the man she saw on magazine covers. His eyes were darker, tired, as if the weight of the whole empire had finally settled on his shoulders. "You're still here?" he asked, his voice rough. Grace nodded, unsure if she should speak. "Almost done, sir." He stepped into the room, pouring himself a drink without asking why she was still working this late. "Do you know what it feels like?" he said after a long pause. "To spend 20 years building something only to watch someone try to tear it down overnight?" Grace froze, unsure how to answer. He wasn't talking to her, not really. He was talking to the room, to the rain outside, to himself. She set the silver down gently and turned to face him. "I know what it's like to work hard and have people still take things from you," she said quietly. Richard looked at her for the first time. Really looked at her, and for a second he didn't see the maid. He saw a woman with fire in her eyes. And maybe that's why it happened. Why the man who had everything made a choice that night that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because pride makes you blind. And Richard Carter was about to learn that some mistakes don't stay buried forever. The storm rolled in just after sunset, drenching the city in sheets of rain. Thunder shook the windows of the Carter estate, and flashes of lightning briefly lit up the marble halls. Grace had stayed late that evening. She wasn't supposed to, but the silver had to be polished before the morning, and she needed the extra hours her brother's school fees were due next week. Most of the staff had gone home early to avoid the storm. The house felt unnaturally quiet, almost hollow, like it was holding its breath. She worked methodically, her hands gliding over the last few pieces of silverware when she heard the sound of tires crunching on the wet driveway. The front door opened. Grace froze. Richard Carter stepped inside, rain dripping from his hair, his expensive suit jacket slung over one shoulder. He looked different tonight. Not the invincible man the world knew. His tie was half untied, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and there was something in his eyes Grace had never seen before. Defeat. He didn't notice her at first. He tossed his jacket onto the nearest chair, loosened his cufflinks, and poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. When he finally saw her, he didn't tell her to leave. "You're still here," he said, his voice hoarse. Grace hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. "Almost done, sir." Richard crossed the room, glass in hand, and sank into one of the dining chairs with a tired sigh. For a moment he just stared at the amber liquid swirling in his glass, like the answer to his problems might be floating somewhere in there. "Do you know what it's like?" he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "To spend 20 years building something, and then watch someone try to burn it all down overnight?" Grace stayed where she was, unsure if this was a question she was supposed to answer. Richard wasn't talking to her, he was talking to the storm, to the ghosts in his head. When she didn't respond, he glanced up at her. "Go ahead, say it. I deserve it. The arrogant billionaire finally loses a deal. Big news, right?" Grace swallowed. "I wouldn't say that, sir." Richard arched a brow, almost amused. "Wouldn't you? Everyone else would." She hesitated, then crossed to the sideboard and poured him another drink before he could ask. She set it down gently. "Sometimes losing something isn't the end of the world," she said quietly. That made him look at her. Really look at her, as though he had never noticed the girl who worked in his house until this very moment. "Is that so?" he asked, leaning back. Grace nodded. "Sometimes losing things makes room for better things. At least that's what my mother used to say." Richard's expression softened for the briefest second, before the mask slipped back into place. "Your mother sounds wiser than most of the people I pay 6 figures to give me advice." Grace almost smiled. For a few moments neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant rumble of thunder and the rain pelting against the windows. Richard ran a hand through his hair. "You ever work this hard for something just to watch someone else take it?" "Yes," Grace said simply. That caught him off guard. He gestured for her to sit, and to her own surprise she did on the very edge of the chair, as though ready to spring up at any moment if he told her she'd crossed a line. "My father," she said softly. "He worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. One night he got hurt at the factory, lost his job. The company fought him for compensation for months. We lost everything. They took the house, the car, Even the old tools he loved. By the time they paid out the settlement, he was too sick to use it. Richard's jaw tightened. I learned something that year, Grace continued. People can take things from you, but they can't take what you build inside yourself. For a moment, Richard just stared at her, caught between admiration and something deeper he couldn't name. You know, he said after a beat, most people just tell me what they think I want to hear. You don't do that. Grace shrugged, looking down at her hands. I don't have much to lose. Richard laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. He finished his drink and poured another, this time for her as well. She shook her head at first, but he insisted. One drink, he said. Call it a thank you for listening. She hesitated, then accepted the glass, holding it carefully like it might break if she gripped it too tightly. They sat there together as the storm raged outside. Two people from completely different worlds, sharing a silence that felt strangely heavy and strangely safe at the same time. Richard talked about the failed merger, about the competitor who had outplayed him. Grace listened without judgment, without pretending to understand the high-stakes world he lived in. And somewhere between the second and third glass of whiskey, something shifted. Maybe it was the storm outside. Maybe it was the loneliness they both carried like a weight. Maybe it was just the fact that Richard for once didn't feel like Richard Carter the billionaire. He just felt like a man sitting across from a woman who saw him as a person, not a headline. He reached across the table and took her hand. Grace froze. It was just a touch at first, warm and steady, but it lingered a second too long. When she looked up at him, there was something in his eyes, something vulnerable, something almost pleading. Richard, she began, but he shook his head. Just don't say anything, he said quietly. Lightning flashed outside, casting his face in pale light. It was the kind of moment you can't explain to anyone else, the kind that feels suspended in time, where one decision will change everything after it. And in that moment, Richard made his decision. By morning, Richard would pretend it never happened. But Grace would never forget. Because that night didn't just change her life, it changed everything. Grace barely slept that night. She lay awake in her small room at the far end of the staff quarters, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every second of what had happened. The storm, his hand on hers, the look in his eyes. It wasn't just what they had done. It was what it meant. By morning, Richard was already gone. The house staff returned, chatting about the weather, gossiping about the failed merger that had made the news. Grace said nothing. She scrubbed the kitchen counters with shaking hands, as though she could wipe away the memory. For weeks they barely spoke, at least not in front of anyone. But when their eyes met across the room, it was like a secret passing between them, a dangerous one. Then one morning, Grace found herself staring at a small white stick in the bathroom, her heart pounding. Positive, the word might as well have been carved into stone. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her stomach. What would she do? Richard was her boss. A man who lived under the constant glare of the media. The kind of man who had more lawyers than friends. Grace tried to tell him twice. The first time he was surrounded by reporters. The second he was on the phone shouting at someone about a deal. Each time she froze, the words stuck in her throat, but she couldn't hide it forever. And when Richard finally found out, not from her, but from someone else, the look in his eyes wasn't the one she remembered from that stormy night. It was cold, calculated, like she was just another problem to solve. Grace's world had gone quiet. Weeks had passed since that stormy night, but the memory of it was still fresh. Too fresh. Every time she saw Richard walk through the front door, dressed in another perfect suit, her stomach twisted. She tried to tell him. Every day, she rehearsed the words in her head, but when the truth finally came, it came in the smallest, simplest way: a thin white stick on the bathroom sink. Positive. The words seemed to echo in her ears. Her knees nearly gave out as she slid to the floor. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind at once: her brother's school fees, the gossip if anyone found out, Richard's face the night of the storm. She pressed both hands to her stomach, whispering a prayer she wasn't even sure how to finish. For 2 days, she said nothing. She worked her shifts quietly, keeping her secret like a stone in her chest. But on the third day, she couldn't hold it anymore. Richard had just come home from a board meeting, his tie undone, his expression unreadable. Grace waited until the staff cleared the dining room before stepping forward. "Sir?" He turned, distracted, phone still in his hand. "Yes?" Grace swallowed hard. I just thought you should know." Richard frowned. "Know what?" Her voice shook. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Richard stared at her, his expression unreadable, like he was trying to process the words. Then, slowly, something shifted. His charm, the warm smile, the easy confidence, vanished. "You think you can trap me?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. Grace flinched. "No, I'm just telling you because—" He held up a hand. "Don't. I know exactly what this is." He crossed to his desk, pulled open a drawer, and scribbled something on a check. "Here," he said coldly, holding it out to her. "Take care of it." Grace stared at the paper in his hand, her heart hammering. "I'm not taking your money," she whispered. Richard's jaw tightened. "Grace, you don't understand. This can't get out. Do you have any idea what this would do to my family? My business?" "This is not about your business," Grace said, her voice breaking. "This is a life." Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Fear, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "You're making a mistake," he said flatly. "No," Grace said, her chin trembling. "You are." She turned and walked away, leaving the check on the edge of his desk. For a moment, Richard just stood there, staring after her. Then he picked up the phone. Grace didn't know what he'd said, but by the end of the day, the housekeeper told her she was no longer needed. No explanation, no goodbye. Just like that, she was out. She packed her things quietly, tears streaming down her face as she folded the uniform she had worn every day for 2 years. Every corner of the house felt like it was watching her. The sky was gray when she stepped outside. Rain started to fall, soaking her hair as she stood there for one last moment, looking up at the mansion she had once thought of as a kind of safety. Now it felt like a prison she was finally leaving. Grace walked down the long driveway with her small suitcase, her shoes sinking into the wet gravel. She didn't know where she would go. She didn't know how she would raise this child. All she knew was that she would not be broken. Grace refused the check, and for that, she lost everything: her job, her reputation, her peace. But what she didn't lose was her strength. She made a choice that night to bring the child into the world no matter the cost. And though Richard Carter thought he had buried the problem, the truth was only beginning to take root. Grace moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. The rent was high and the walls were thin, but it was hers. She found work cleaning at a local hotel. It didn't pay much, but she made it work. Every night she placed one hand over her growing stomach and whispered, "I've got you." 9 months later, in a dimly lit hospital room, Grace held her baby boy for the first time. He was perfect. Tiny fingers, a little tuft of dark hair, and a pair of hazel eyes that nearly stopped her heart. Hazel eyes, Richard's eyes. Grace kissed the baby's forehead, tears running down her cheeks. "No matter what," she whispered, "you will never feel unwanted. Not like I did tonight." Grace thought she had left Richard Carter's world behind. But secrets have a way of finding their way back to the surface. And one day, those hazel eyes would look straight at the man who tried to deny them and make him face the truth he had spent years running from. The first year was the hardest. Grace learned to live with less food, less sleep, less certainty about tomorrow. But when she held her son in her arms, all of it felt worth it. She named him Leo after her father. Leo was quiet, curious, and far too observant for a baby. As he grew, Grace began to notice it wasn't just his hazel eyes that reminded her of Richard. It was the little furrow of his brow when he was concentrating, the stubborn tilt of his chin when he didn't get his way. Sometimes she caught herself staring at him too long, her heart twisting between love and anger. "Don't ever think you're not wanted," she whispered to him one night, rocking him to sleep. "I don't care who your father is. You are mine." By the time Leo turned 4, Grace had built a quiet life. She worked mornings at the hotel and spent her afternoons taking Leo to the park, teaching him his letters, saving every extra dollar she could. But the world had a way of reminding her of what she had lost. Every now and then, she would see Richard's face on the cover of a magazine at the grocery store. Billionaire Carter expands empire. Richard Carter celebrates 10 years of marriage. Each headline was like a little cut. One evening, while picking up Leo I from daycare, Grace overheard 2 women talking in line. "Did you hear about Richard Carter's gala next month? Everyone's going to be there." Grace's chest tightened. She hadn't heard his name spoken out loud in years. That night, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table long after Eli had gone to bed, scrolling through news articles on her old phone. Pictures of Richard smiling at cameras, holding his wife's hand, standing in front of skyscrapers he owned. Her anger flared. He got to keep everything: his business, his reputation, his perfect life. And she had been the one to carry the weight alone. Then came the letter. It wasn't from Richard, not directly. It was an invitation to the very gala the women had been whispering about. Grace nearly threw it away, but something stopped her. She stared at the heavy envelope, her fingers tracing the gold lettering. Why had they sent her this? She didn't know. But that night, as Leo slept peacefully in the next room, Grace sat on the edge of her bed with the invitation in her lap, her heart pounding. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was dangerous, but some small part of her, the part that had stayed silent for 4 long years, whispered that it was time. Time for Richard Carter to see the child he had denied. Grace had spent years hiding from Richard's world. But fate has a cruel sense of timing, and what was meant to be just another glittering party for the rich would become the night Richard Carter came face to face with the truth he thought he'd buried forever. Grace put the invitation down and looked at Leo, sleeping with his tiny fist curled under his cheek. "Maybe you deserve to be seen," she whispered. The decision was made. Grace's life became a war she fought silently every day. When her son Leo was born, the world seemed to pause for one perfect second, just long enough for Grace to hold him against her chest and forget everything else. The pain, the betrayal, the humiliation, all of it melted away as she looked into his tiny hazel eyes. But the world didn't stay paused for long. Bills didn't care that she had a newborn. Landlords didn't care that she was a single mother. The world kept demanding, and Grace kept giving. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning at a hotel by day and scrubbing office floors by night. Most nights, she collapsed into bed for 3 hours of sleep before Leo woke her crying. She smiled through her exhaustion because Leo was worth it. He was the one thing she had done right. But whispers had a way of traveling faster than hope. A month after Leo's birth, Grace did the one thing she swore she would never do. She called a lawyer. "I just want him to take responsibility," she said quietly, her hands twisting in her lap. The lawyer nodded. "We can pursue paternity. You have a strong case." For a moment, Grace felt something like relief. But Richard Carter had the kind of money that could bend the law. The case never even made it to court. Documents went missing. Witnesses backed out. The lawyer stopped returning her calls. And then the tabloids struck. Gold-digging maid claims billionaire's baby. Desperate single mother wants Carter fortune. Grace's name was dragged through the mud, her character picked apart by strangers who had never met her. She stopped going out. She stopped answering calls from old friends. She learned to walk fast with her head down, hoping no one would recognize her. But through it all, Leo kept growing, and every time he smiled, she remembered why she hadn't taken that check. While Grace fought her battle alone, somewhere across the city, Evelyn Carter was fighting her own quiet war. Evelyn had seen the tabloid headlines too. And while most people dismissed them, something about the story gnawed at her. She knew her husband. She knew the way he looked at women when he thought no one was watching. She knew the stormy night he hadn't come home until dawn, smelling of whiskey and rain. And now here was a maid claiming to have his child. At first, Evelyn thought it was just another scandal to crush before it could ruin their image. She hired a private investigator, told him to dig up everything on Grace, dirt, lies, anything they could use to silence her. But the deeper the investigator dug, the less Evelyn liked what she saw. Grace wasn't what the tabloids made her out to be. She wasn't a grifter, she wasn't a social climber, she was just a girl who had been discarded. And then there was the baby. One night, Evelyn sat in her car outside Grace's apartment building, watching as Grace came out carrying a small boy. Her breath caught when she saw him. The boy had Richard's eyes. Everyone thought Evelyn wanted to destroy Grace. But behind closed doors, Evelyn was uncovering a truth even she didn't expect. Evelyn went home that night, poured herself a glass of wine, and stared at the man she had shared a bed with for over a decade. "Where were you the night of the storm?" she asked quietly. Richard looked up from his laptop, surprised. "What storm?" She set the wine glass down. "The night the merger fell through. You didn't come home until morning." Richard's jaw tightened. "I was working." Evelyn said nothing. But that night, for the first time, she slept on the opposite edge of the bed, her back to him. Grace had no idea that Evelyn was watching her. No idea that her greatest enemy was slowly becoming the only person who believed her. Her focus was survival. Every day was a cycle: work, care for Leo, work again, sleep if she was lucky. But the pressure never let up. Her rent went up. Leo got sick one winter and the hospital bills nearly sank her. And yet Grace refused to bend. "I'm not going to let him win," she whispered one night, sitting by Leo's bed as he slept. "I don't care if the world thinks I'm lying. One day they'll see the truth." On the other side of town, Evelyn was building her own case. Every invoice, every photograph, every witness who remembered seeing Richard and Grace alone together that night. The puzzle was coming together piece by piece, and when it was finished, Evelyn knew she would have a choice to make one that could destroy her marriage, but finally give Grace the justice she deserved. The truth was a double-edged sword, and Evelyn Carter was ready to wield it. Grace was fighting to survive. Evelyn was fighting to know the truth. And Richard Carter, the man at the center of it all, had no idea that the two women he had underestimated were about to collide with his carefully built world. The tension grew like a storm on the horizon. Grace could feel it even if she didn't know why. Something was coming, something bigger than all of them. And when it arrived, it would drag every secret into the light. The tension was no longer invisible. Grace felt it every time she walked outside, every time she saw Richard's name in a headline. The world still treated him like a god, the brilliant billionaire who could do no wrong, while she was the footnote in his story. But Leo was growing fast, and with every year it became harder to hide the truth. He looked more like Richard now, not just the hazel eyes but the sharp cheekbones, the way he sometimes stood with his hands in his pockets, like he owned the room. Grace would catch herself staring at him across the kitchen table and think, one day the world will see what I see. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter was running out of patience. Her investigation had been quiet, almost invisible, but it was consuming her. Late nights found her sitting in the study, folders spread across the desk, photographs of Grace and Leo in her hands. She told herself it was about protecting her family, but deep down she knew it was about more than that. The night she first saw Leo up close, something inside her shifted. The boy's face haunted her. It wasn't just the resemblance, it was the injustice. Grace had been painted as a liar, humiliated, pushed out into the rain. And Richard had walked away untouched. Evelyn's anger wasn't clean. It was complicated, sharp enough to cut both ways. One evening she confronted Richard again, this time with papers in hand. I know, she said quietly, standing in the doorway to his office. Richard glanced up. Know what? She dropped the papers on his desk. Grainy photos of Grace leaving the hospital, holding Leo. You don't get to lie to me anymore, Evelyn said. Richard's jaw tightened. This isn't what you think. Don't. Evelyn's voice cracked, but her gaze stayed steady. I've spent months pretending not to see what's in front of me. But I see it now. And so will everyone else if you keep hiding. Richard stood, his face hard. Evelyn, you don't know what's at stake. I know exactly what's at stake, she said. And I'm done protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. She turned and walked out, leaving Richard staring after her, his perfect world beginning to shake. Grace still didn't know that Evelyn had shifted from enemy to reluctant ally. Her days were a blur work, Leo, exhaustion until one evening an envelope arrived. Inside was a single card with gold lettering, Carter Foundation Annual Gala. Grace stared at it, her hands trembling. For a moment she considered tearing it up, but then she saw Leo sitting on the floor, building a tower of blocks with a look of fierce concentration that was all too familiar. She thought about the years of silence, the court that refused to hear her, the tabloids that called her a liar, the man who told her to take care of it. Grace set the invitation on the table. No more hiding, she whispered. Evelyn was the one who made sure the invitation reached her. Part of her wondered if she was being cruel, if she was inviting disaster. But another part of her, the part that had been quietly burning with anger for years, wanted Richard to be forced to face what he had done, not in private, but under the lights of his perfect public world. And Evelyn would be there to watch. The night of the gala arrived like the breaking of a storm. Grace dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress she had saved for months to buy. It wasn't glamorous, but it made her feel steady, grounded. Leo clutched her hand as they stepped out of the cab in front of the glittering hotel. The crowd of photographers outside barely noticed her at first, just another guest. But heads turned as she walked past, holding the little boy whose eyes reflected the flash of every camera. Inside, the ballroom was alive with laughter, champagne glasses clinking, and music swelling under the golden chandeliers. Richard Carter stood near the stage, smiling for photographs, every inch the untouchable king of his empire. But when the crowd parted and he saw Grace for the first time in 4 years, saw the boy standing at her side, the smile vanished. The room went still. The billionaire's charm faded like a dying light, and for the first time in years, Richard Carter's world no longer felt untouchable. Grace met his gaze across the room. She didn't flinch, neither did Leo. And in that moment, Richard knew no check, no lawyer, No cover-up in the world could erase what was standing in front of him now. The ballroom glittered under the crystal chandeliers, every table draped in gold, every guest dressed in their most expensive evening wear. The orchestra played softly in the background as waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, Richard Carter's 55th birthday, the crown jewel of the year's social calendar. But then the doors opened. Grace stepped inside, her black dress modest but elegant, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. And beside her, clutching her hand, was Leo, wide-eyed, dressed in a tiny suit that made him look far too grown up for his age. For a moment no one noticed, then the whispers began. "Is that? Who invited her? Who's the boy?" Cameras turned toward them, the flashing lights startling Leo, but Grace squeezed his hand gently. Across the room, Richard froze mid-laugh. The champagne flute in his hand tilted dangerously before he set it down. His smile faltered. He saw the boy, and for the first time in his life, the man who had built empires, who had stared down CEOs and politicians without blinking, looked afraid. For the first time, Richard saw himself not in the mirror, not in the press, but in a little boy's eyes. Grace didn't wait for permission. She walked straight across the room, every step slow, deliberate, cutting through the murmurs and stolen glances. Richard's wife, Evelyn, stood near the stage. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and in that silent exchange, Grace understood Evelyn had wanted this moment to happen. When Grace reached Richard, the room was silent enough to hear the faint clink of a champagne glass being set down somewhere near the back. "Hello, Richard," Grace said, her voice calm but carrying through the space. Richard swallowed, his jaw tight. "What are you doing here?" Grace's hand trembled, but she didn't let go of Leo. "Showing you what you threw away," she said softly. Leo looked up at Richard then, his hazel eyes locking on the billionaire's face with a child's open, unguarded curiosity. And that was when it happened, that split second when Richard's face changed. The confident billionaire's mask slipped, and the man beneath it was just human. The resemblance was undeniable. You could hear the collective inhale of the crowd as realization spread like wildfire. Richard turned abruptly, motioning to his head of security. "Get them out of here." But Evelyn's voice cut through the air, clear and sharp. "No." Every head turned toward her. She stepped forward, her gown catching the light, her face calm but her eyes fierce. "They're staying." Richard stared at her, shocked. "Evelyn, this isn't..." "This isn't what?" Evelyn interrupted. "Real, because it is, and you know it." She turned to Grace, her expression softening. "Tell them," Evelyn said quietly. Grace's throat tightened. She hadn't planned for this, for everyone to be watching, for the truth to hang in the air like this. But there was no turning back now. She nodded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Leo is Richard's son," she said simply. Gasps rippled through the room. Phones were raised. Flashes went off. Somewhere, someone whispered, "Oh my God." Richard's world was crumbling in real time. "Grace," he said under his breath, stepping closer. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Grace lifted her chin. "I'm giving my son what you wouldn't acknowledgement." Leo's small hand squeezed hers and she felt her heart ache with both fear and pride. "This isn't about money, Richard," Grace continued, her voice low but firm. "It never was. I just wanted him to know he existed in your world, to know he wasn't a mistake." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then he turned, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, seeing the judgment in their eyes. All the power he had spent a lifetime building felt suddenly small. In that moment, Richard faced a choice. Hide behind lawyers as he always had, or do the one thing he had spent years avoiding, take responsibility. Richard dropped his gaze to Leo again. The boy tilted his head, studying him the same way Richard himself often did in business meetings. Evelyn realized with a pang, and then something inside Richard cracked. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was no humor in it. "This was never supposed to happen," he said quietly. Grace's voice softened, but it did. Richard closed his eyes for a long moment, then turned to the crowd. "This is my son," he said finally, the words sounding strange and heavy on his tongue. The room erupted in noise-shocked whispers, journalists typing furiously, cameras flashing, but Richard didn't look at anyone else. He looked only at Leo. "Happy birthday," Leo said shyly, his voice barely above a whisper. And Richard broke. For the first time in his life, he stepped forward, not as Richard Carter the billionaire, but as a man, and knelt so he could look his son in the eye. "Hi," Richard said quietly, his voice rough. "Hi," Leo said back, smiling just a little. Richard swallowed hard, his hand trembling as he reached out, and to everyone's shock, Grace let Leo take it. Evelyn watched them, her throat tight. She wasn't angry anymore. For the first time in years, she saw Richard not as the man who betrayed her, but as the man she had once loved, now finally facing the truth. And somehow that felt like enough. The gala was meant to celebrate Richard's power. Instead, it revealed his greatest weakness and his greatest redemption, because that night, the billionaire who had everything finally learned what it meant to lose, and what it meant to choose differently. When the orchestra struck up the next song, the spell was broken. Guests began murmuring again, the noise of the party returning like a wave. But in the center of the room, Richard stayed kneeling in front of Leo as though the rest of the world no longer existed. And Grace, for the first time in 4 years, felt something she hadn't dared to feel since that stormy night. Peace. The gala didn't end the way anyone expected. What was meant to be a polished night of toasts and speeches became a media storm before dessert was even served. Guests whispered, phones buzzed, and by the time Grace and Leo left the ballroom, the story was already trending online. Billionaire Richard Carter acknowledges secret son at birthday gala. Grace held Leo's hand tightly as they slipped into the night. She half expected Richard to follow them, to demand control over how this story played out. But he didn't. Instead, Evelyn met her outside, her expression unreadable. "You were brave tonight," Evelyn said quietly. Grace hesitated. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone." "I know," Evelyn said, and to Grace's surprise, she smiled, a small, tired smile, but real. "Richard needed to see him," Evelyn continued, "and maybe I needed to see you." Grace didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. "Take care of him," Evelyn said softly, glancing at Leo. "Both of you deserve better than the silence you've been given." Then she turned and went back inside, leaving Grace standing on the steps with a strange feeling in her chest. Not anger, not sadness, but something close to relief. Inside the ballroom, Richard stayed behind after the last guest left, staring at the now empty stage. For years, he had thought of himself as untouchable, as someone who could control the narrative of his life. But that night proved him wrong. He thought about Grace, about the way she had stood in front of him without fear, and about Leo, who had looked at him with the kind of openness Richard hadn't felt since he was a boy himself. And for the first time, Richard realized that money couldn't buy the one thing he wanted most right now: time. Time he had already lost. The next morning, Richard called a press conference. Reporters expected denial, spin, damage control. Instead, Richard told the truth. "Yes," he said, standing at the podium. "Leo is my son. I made mistakes. I let my pride make decisions for me, and I hurt people I should have protected. That ends today." The room fell silent. "From this moment on," Richard continued, his voice steady, "I will be present in my son's life, not as a headline, not as a photo opportunity, but as his father." For a man known for his arrogance, it was the most vulnerable thing he had ever done. Grace watched the broadcast from her small apartment. She didn't know if she could ever forgive Richard completely, but as she looked at Leo sitting beside her, eating cereal and swinging his legs, she realized forgiveness wasn't just for Richard, it was for her. She had been carrying anger for so long, and suddenly she felt a little lighter. Weeks passed, and slowly a new rhythm formed. Richard began visiting Leo at first under Grace's watchful eye, then later for short outings. He didn't try to buy Leo's affection with gifts. Instead, he listened. He asked about school, about his favorite books, about why he liked dinosaurs more than superheroes. Sometimes Richard and Grace still argued about boundaries, about decisions, but there was a new sense of honesty between them, and Evelyn surprised everyone by staying. When asked by a friend why she hadn't left Richard after the scandal, she simply said, "Walking away would have been easy. Staying and watching him grow into the man he should have been, that's harder. But sometimes the hardest thing is the right thing." Months later, at a small park near Grace's apartment, Richard sat on the grass watching Leo climb the jungle gym. Grace sat a few feet away, sipping coffee, still wary but no longer guarded. Richard glanced at her. "You know, I used to think I had everything," he said. "And now?" Grace asked. Richard smiled faintly as Leo waved at him from the top of the slide. "Now I know what everything actually looks like." Grace didn't answer, but she smiled too for the first time in a very long time. Richard Carter had spent a lifetime building towers, empires, legacies made of steel. But it took one small boy, and the woman he had wronged, to show him that the greatest legacy he could ever leave was love. The camera lingers on Leo running toward both his parents, his laughter filling the air. Grace and Richard standing side by side. For once, there are no flashing cameras, no reporters, just a family finding its way back from years of silence. We all make choices. Some build us, some break us. But if we are lucky, life gives us one more chance to face the truth, to make it right, and to choose differently. The ballroom felt like it was holding its breath. Richard was still on his feet, trying to form the words to explain everything when Evelyn stood. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. The entire room went still, as though someone had turned the volume down on life itself. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she stepped forward, her elegant gown whispering around her legs. Grace felt her chest tighten. Evelyn's expression was calm, almost too calm, the kind of stillness that came before a storm. "Grace didn't lie," Evelyn said, her voice steady but laced with steel. The words cracked across the silence like thunder. Richard blinked, thrown off balance. "Evelyn, no," she cut him off, her tone sharper now, years of restrained fury spilling out. "You lied. You bribed a judge. You bought silence. You ruined a woman's life. And for what?" She turned, looking directly at the crowd as if daring them to disagree. "To protect your ego?" Gasps rippled through the guests. Someone near the back muttered, "Bribed a judge?" Phones were already raised, recording every second. Richard's face had gone pale. "Evelyn, this isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," Evelyn snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "You built this world, Richard. This shiny little kingdom where you think you get to decide whose truth matters. Well, tonight, everyone gets to see what you buried." Grace's breath caught. She had dreamed of justice for years, but she had never imagined it would come from the woman she once thought was her enemy. Evelyn's voice softened, but her words landed like blows. "You wanted to protect your image, but all you did was prove you cared more about yourself than the people you claimed to love. You didn't just deny a child, Richard. You denied yourself the chance to be a father." Richard's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. Evelyn took a slow breath, her anger cooling into something far more dangerous. "Resolve. And now," she said, her tone almost serene, "you can't erase him. Not anymore." Richard's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Evelyn stepped closer, her presence suddenly commanding. "Leo isn't just your son. As of this morning, he is your heir. Every share I own is now locked in a trust with his name on it. You can't touch it. You can't buy it back. And you can't pretend he doesn't exist." The room exploded with shocked murmurs. Someone actually gasped loud enough for everyone to hear. Richard stumbled back as though her words had struck him. He sank into a chair, his chest rising and falling quickly. For years he had been the man with the plan, the man in control. And now the floor had shifted under him and he was falling. "You planned this," he said finally, his voice raw. Evelyn's eyes softened, not with pity, but with something that looked a little like relief. "No," she said. "You did. The moment you chose pride over truth, you wrote this ending. I just made sure you couldn't hide from it." Grace felt something rise in her chest, not anger, not grief, but something fierce and liberating. She straightened her back, standing taller than she ever had in front of Richard. "I didn't come here to destroy you," she said quietly. "But maybe this is the justice we were all waiting for." Richard's eyes darted between the two women, Grace with her chin high, Evelyn with her arms crossed, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the most powerful person in the room. The weight of years of decisions pressed down on him until he couldn't stay seated. Slowly, heavily, he stood and crossed to where Leo stood, still holding Grace's hand. The boy looked up at him with those wide hazel eyes, the eyes Richard had tried to forget. Richard dropped to one knee, his voice barely audible. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I can't undo what I did to your mom. But if you'll let me, I want to try to be your dad." The boy studied him for a long moment before nodding once, solemnly. Grace's throat tightened. She didn't know if she could forgive Richard, not yet. But for the first time she believed he meant what he said. When Richard finally stood, his shoulders seemed heavier, but his expression clearer. For the first time, Richard Carter, billionaire, kingmaker, media darling, looked like just a man. And Grace realized she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Evelyn stepped back, her job done, her face unreadable. But when her eyes met Grace's, there was no hostility there, only a quiet acknowledgement. Both women had been wronged, both had been silenced, and tonight, both had spoken. The gala had been meant to celebrate Richard's power. Instead, it had stripped him bare and given Grace and Leo the one thing money couldn't buy: recognition. By the time the orchestra played again and the chatter resumed, nothing in that ballroom was the same. And everyone present knew they had witnessed something far more historic than a birthday toast. The music eventually returned, soft and hesitant at first, like the party itself wasn't sure whether to keep going. Guests murmured in clusters, pretending to sip champagne while sneaking glances at Grace, Evelyn, and Richard, but Grace barely noticed them. Her eyes stayed on Leo, who was now sitting cross-legged on one of the velvet chairs, clutching a slice of birthday cake like he had no idea the night had just changed his entire life. For years she had dreamed of this moment of Richard finally seeing his son. She thought it would feel like victory, like the weight of the world being lifted. Instead, it felt complicated. Richard stood a few feet away, staring out one of the massive windows, his reflection barely recognizable in the glass. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders tense as though he were holding himself together by force. Grace almost pitied him. Almost. Evelyn broke the silence first. "You should go," she said softly, her eyes on Grace. Grace blinked, startled. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to take your son home before this circus gets worse," Evelyn said. "But not before you and Richard talk. Alone." Richard turned, his jaw tightening. "Evelyn," but Evelyn's look silenced him. "This is not about you saving face anymore. It's about whether you have the courage to do the right thing without a camera on you." Grace hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk out, to take Leo and never look back. She had done her part. Richard had seen the truth. The world had heard it. What more was there to say? But another part of her, the part that had carried silent anger for years, knew this was the only chance to speak freely, to look Richard in the eye and make him face everything. "Fine," Grace said. 5 minutes. They stepped into one of the side rooms, a private study lined with leather-bound books and a single glowing lamp. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. His voice was quieter than Grace had ever heard it. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Grace crossed her arms. "Good, because I don't." Richard winced, but he didn't look away. "I was a coward," he admitted. "The night you told me about Leo, I panicked. Everything I had built felt like it would crumble if the truth got out, so I did what I always do. I tried to control the narrative, pay people off, make problems disappear." Grace's throat tightened. "I wasn't a problem. I was a person, and so was he." Richard's eyes flickered, and for a brief second Grace saw something raw regret, maybe even shame. "I know," he said finally, "and I've thought about that night every single day since. I thought I could forget. I thought if I buried it deep enough it would stop hurting. But seeing him tonight..." He broke off, shaking his head. "I don't want to be that man anymore." Grace let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "You can say all the right words, Richard, but words won't undo the years I raised him alone." "I don't want to undo them," Richard said quickly. "I just want to be part of what comes next, if you'll let me." Grace studied him for a long time, searching for some hint of the arrogant man she had once known. He wasn't gone, not completely, but there was something new in his eyes, something humbled. "You'll have to earn it," she said finally. "Leo doesn't need a billionaire. He needs a father who shows up, who tells the truth, who puts him first." Richard nodded slowly. "Then that's what I'll be." Grace didn't trust him yet, but for the first time, she believed he might actually try. Outside, the party was still buzzing, but Evelyn stood near the door waiting. Grace hesitated. "We'll see." Evelyn nodded as though that was enough. As Grace gathered Leo and started toward the exit, Evelyn caught her arm gently. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Grace frowned. "For what?" "For not letting him hide anymore," Evelyn said simply. "I stayed married to a man who thought he could buy away consequences. Tonight, you made sure he couldn't." Grace wasn't sure what to say, so she simply nodded and walked out into the cool night. The weeks that followed were strange. The tabloids exploded with headlines. Billionaire's secret son revealed. Carter family scandal rocks social media. Grace tried to shield Leo from it as much as she could, but she couldn't stop the curious stares at the grocery store, the whispers at school pickup. Richard, to his credit, didn't hide. He gave a single press statement acknowledging Leo and took no questions. Then, quietly, he started showing up. At first, Grace was wary. She watched him closely during his visits, the way he knelt to tie Leo's shoes, the way he laughed too hard at his silly jokes, the way his face softened when Leo reached for his hand. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes Richard said the wrong thing. Sometimes Grace still bristled when she looked at him. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. One evening, several months later, Richard stopped by after work. Leo had fallen asleep on the couch, a half-built Lego set on the table beside him. Grace stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You stayed late," she said. Richard nodded. Board meeting. Then, after a pause, he added, I stepped down as CEO. Grace blinked. You what? I put someone else in charge, Richard said quietly. I want to spend more time here, more time with him. Grace didn't know what to say. She had expected grand gestures, public apologies, but this quiet surrender felt more meaningful. You really mean it, she said softly. Richard nodded once. I do. For the first time, Grace felt something loosen inside her, not forgiveness. Not yet. But the first fragile thread of it forming. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Grace stood at the edge of a park watching Richard push Leo on the swings. Leo's laughter rang out, bright and unburdened. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Maybe this was what justice looked like, not just exposing the truth, but making sure something good came from it. When Richard glanced over at her, she met his eyes and nodded just once. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. In the end, this was never about revenge. It was about truth, about choosing courage over fear. Grace didn't just fight for her son's name, she fought for his future. And in the process, she gave Richard the one thing money could never buy, a second chance to be the man he should have been all along. The music eventually returned, soft and hesitant at first, like the party itself wasn't sure whether to keep going. Guests murmured in clusters, pretending to sip champagne while sneaking glances at Grace, Evelyn, and Richard. But Grace barely noticed them. Her eyes stayed on Leo, who was now sitting cross-legged on one of the velvet chairs, clutching a slice of birthday cake like he had no idea the night had just changed his entire life. For years, she had dreamed of this moment, of Richard finally seeing his son. She thought it would feel like victory, like the weight of the world being lifted. Instead, it felt complicated. Richard stood a few feet away, staring out one of the massive windows, his reflection barely recognizable in the glass. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders tense as though he were holding himself together by force. Grace almost pitied him. Almost. Evelyn broke the silence first. You should go, she said softly, her eyes on Grace. Grace blinked, startled. You want me to leave? I want you to take your son home before this circus gets worse, Evelyn said. But not before you and Richard talk. Alone. Richard turned, his jaw tightening. Evelyn! But Evelyn's look silenced him. This is not about you saving face anymore. It's about whether you have the courage to do the right thing without a camera on you. Grace hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk out, to take Leo and never look back. She had done her part. Richard had seen the truth. The world had heard it. What more was there to say? But another part of her, the part that had carried silent anger for years, knew this was the only chance to speak freely, to look Richard in the eye and make him face everything. Fine, Grace said, 5 minutes. They stepped into one of the side rooms, a private study lined with leather-bound books and a single glowing lamp. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. His voice was quieter than Grace had ever heard it. I don't expect you to forgive me. Grace crossed her arms. Good, because I don't. Richard winced, but he didn't look away. I was a coward, he admitted. The night you told me about Leo, I panicked. Everything I had built felt like it would crumble if the truth got out. So I did what I always do. I tried to control the narrative, pay people off. Grace's throat tightened. I wasn't a problem. I was a person, and so was he. Richard's eyes flickered, and for a brief second Grace saw something raw regret, maybe even shame. I know, he said finally, and I've thought about that night every single day since. I thought I could forget. I thought if I buried it deep enough it would stop hurting. But seeing him tonight, he broke off, shaking his head. I don't want to be that man anymore. Grace let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. You can say all the right words, Richard, but words won't undo the years I raised him alone. I don't want to undo them, Richard said quickly. I just want to be part of what comes next, if you'll let me. Grace studied him for a long time, searching for some hint of the arrogant man she had once known. He wasn't gone, not completely, but there was something new in his eyes, something humbled. You'll have to earn it, she said finally. Leo doesn't need a billionaire. He needs a father who shows up, who tells the truth, who puts him first. Richard nodded slowly. Then that's what I'll be. Grace didn't trust him yet, but for the first time, she believed he might actually try. Outside, the party was still buzzing, but Evelyn stood near the door waiting. How did it go? She asked quietly. Grace hesitated. We'll see. Evelyn nodded as though that was enough. As Grace gathered Leo and started toward the exit, Evelyn caught her arm gently. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Grace frowned. "For what?" "For not letting him hide anymore," Evelyn said simply. "I stayed married to a man who thought he could buy away consequences. Tonight, you made sure he couldn't." Grace wasn't sure what to say, so she simply nodded and walked out into the cool night. The weeks that followed were strange. The tabloids exploded with headlines. Billionaire's secret son revealed. Carter family scandal rocks social media. Grace tried to shield Leo from it as much as she could, but she couldn't stop the curious stares at the grocery store, the whispers at school pickup. Richard, to his credit, didn't hide. He gave a single press statement acknowledging Leo and took no questions. Then, quietly, he started showing up. At first, Grace was wary. She watched him closely during his visits, the way he knelt to tie Leo's shoes, the way he laughed too hard at his silly jokes, the way his face softened when Leo reached for his hand. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes Richard said the wrong thing. Sometimes Grace still bristled when she looked at him. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. One evening, several months later, Richard stopped by after work. Leo had fallen asleep on the couch, a half-built Lego set on the table beside him. Grace stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You stayed late," she said. Richard nodded. "Board meeting." Then, after a pause, he added, "I stepped down as CEO." Grace blinked. "You what?" "I put someone else in charge," Richard said quietly. "I want to spend more time here, more time with him." Grace didn't know what to say. She had expected grand gestures, public apologies, but this quiet surrender felt more meaningful. "You really mean it," she said softly. Richard nodded once. "I do." For the first time, Grace felt something loosen inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first fragile thread of it forming. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Grace stood at the edge of a park watching Richard push Leo on the swings. Leo's laughter rang out, bright and unburdened. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Maybe this was what justice looked like, not just exposing the truth, but making sure something good came from it. When Richard glanced over at her, she met his eyes and nodded just once. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. In the end, this was never about revenge. It was about truth, about choosing courage over fear. Grace didn't just fight for her son's name, she fought for his future. And in the process, she gave Richard the one thing money could never buy, a second chance to be the man he should have been all along. The ballroom had emptied, but the echoes of that night lingered long after the last guest left. Richard stood alone for a long while, staring at the table where Grace and Leo had sat. His untouched birthday cake sat there. Candles melted into nothing. The house felt different now. Not the seat of power he once ruled from, but a place that had just witnessed his undoing. For weeks, the world buzzed with headlines. Some painted Richard as a man humbled. Others called it the biggest scandal in his career. But Richard didn't read them. Instead, he sat in his office late at night staring at an old photograph of himself as a boy, standing in front of his father's mechanic shop. His father's hands had been stained with grease, but his eyes had been kind. "You always said a man's word is all he has," Richard whispered to the photograph. "I broke mine." The admission gutted him, but it also lit something in him, the first spark of a different kind of fight. Richard began to make changes. He called his legal team and began undoing every quiet bribe, every hidden payout. He reached out to Grace's former employers and cleared her name, making sure no record of her termination for misconduct remained. When Grace found out, she didn't thank him. She didn't need to. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about Richard cleaning up the mess he had made. The first time Richard visited Leo after the gala, he was visibly nervous. He came without a driver, without security, just a man in a plain shirt and rolled-up sleeves, carrying a box of Legos under his arm. Leo eyed him suspiciously at first, but soon warmed up when Richard crouched on the floor and started building with him, asking questions about every piece. Grace watched from the kitchen, arms crossed, pretending not to notice. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Over the next few months, Richard kept showing up. Not with gifts or grand gestures, though he could have bought Leo the entire toy store, but with time. He came to soccer practices. He showed up for school events, sitting quietly in the back so as not to cause a scene. And each time, Grace noticed something different about him. The sharpness in his tone softened. The restless need to check his phone every 5 minutes faded. He was learning how to just be present. But Grace's journey wasn't just about Richard. With the money Evelyn had secured in Leo's trust, Grace no longer had to work 2 jobs. She took evening classes, finishing the degree she had abandoned years ago. She laughed more, smiled more, slept more, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to dream. One late afternoon, Richard invited Grace and Leo to the Carter estate not for a party, but for something different. The house, usually buzzing with staff, was quiet. Richard led them to the backyard, where a single oak tree stood tall and strong. At its base was a freshly planted sapling, its roots just beginning to take hold. "This was my father's tree," Richard said quietly. "I had it moved here when we built the house. It's been growing with me all these years. I planted this one for Leo, so he has something that's his, something that will outlive all of us." Grace's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this. Leo ran up and touched the little tree, smiling as though he understood the gesture in some small way. Richard looked at Grace then, and for the first time she didn't see the man who had hurt her. She saw a man trying, stumbling, but trying. "Thank you," she said softly, the words surprising even her. Richard blinked. "For what?" "For showing up," Grace said simply. Time passed and wounds slowly turned into scars. Grace still had nights when she remembered the betrayal and felt the ache. But those nights grew fewer, and one evening, as she tucked Leo into bed, she realized something. She wasn't angry anymore. Not at Richard, not at the past. She was free. The next time she saw Richard, she told him, "I don't forgive you because I have to," she said, standing in the doorway. "I forgive you because I want to." Richard swallowed hard, his eyes bright with something unspoken. "I don't deserve that," he said quietly. "Maybe not," Grace replied. "But Leo does. He deserves 2 parents who can be in the same room without the weight of hate between them." For the first time, Richard smiled a real smile, not the one he wore for cameras. "Then let's give him that," he said. Months later, on a warm spring afternoon, the 3 of them sat under the oak tree. Leo played in the grass, laughing, while Grace and Richard sat quietly sipping iced tea. There was no tension, no courtroom, no gala crowd. Just a family not perfect, not traditional, but real. Richard Carter had conquered markets, crushed rivals, built an empire. But the greatest victory of his life was learning how to kneel, to face his own reflection not in a mirror, not in the headlines, but in the hazel eyes of a little boy who deserved more than excuses. Grace didn't win by destroying him. She won by refusing to stay silent, by protecting her son's truth. And in the process, she gave Richard a chance to choose something greater than power redemption. Grace stood, brushing grass from her jeans, and held out her hand for Leo. As she walked away, she didn't feel the weight she had carried for years. She felt light, free. The truth might break you, but it will set you freer, no matter who you are. Because power fades, wealth disappears, but the courage to face what's real, that's what lasts. The screen goes black, and the words appear in simple white text. Your truth is your power. Don't let anyone take it away. Soft, uplifting music swells. End card fades in. The oak tree became their meeting place. At first, it was just for short visits afternoons when Richard would stop by to read with Leo, or watch him chase butterflies through the grass. But as the seasons changed, so did their bond. One chilly autumn afternoon, Richard brought a photo album with him. It was filled with pictures no one else had ever seen. Grainy black and white photos of his father's shop, his mother's kitchen, the tiny house he had once shared with 2 siblings before he left for college. Leo sat cross-legged, turning the pages with wide eyes. "You were really this little?" he asked, pointing to a picture of Richard as a freckled boy with grease on his cheek. Richard smiled, a quiet, almost sad smile. "Yeah," he said, "and I thought if I worked hard enough I'd never have to feel small again." Grace, sitting nearby, felt the weight of that confession. For years she had painted Richard as the villain in her story, the man who had stolen her peace, denied her truth. But in that moment, she saw a different Richard, not just a billionaire or a headline, but a boy who had once been small, scared, and desperate to never be powerless again. She still didn't excuse what he had done, but she understood it a little more. Winter came, and with it came the first holiday they would all spend together. Grace had worried it would feel awkward, but when Leo insisted on putting Richard's name on a gift tag, she didn't stop him. Christmas morning was quiet. No cameras, no servants, no press releases. Just wrapping paper scattered across Grace's small living room, and Leo squealing over his new bike. Richard didn't give anything extravagant, just a simple hand-carved wooden puzzle he had commissioned from an artisan in the town where he grew up. Leo loved it. Grace found herself smiling, not because of the gift, but because Richard had chosen something thoughtful, something that showed he was paying attention to who his son really was. As the months passed, Grace found that her anger had softened into something else, something more fragile but far more freeing. She was no longer defined by what Richard had done to her. She was defined by what she had done for herself for Leo. Her classes were nearly complete. She had been offered a new job at a non-profit helping single mothers navigate the legal system, and she had accepted it without hesitation. One night, after putting Leo to bed, she stood at the window and realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building a future. Richard noticed the change too. One evening, after a long day, he stayed behind after dinner. Grace found him standing outside, looking up at the night sky. "You're different," he said quietly when she joined him. "I'm free," she replied. Richard turned to her, his face lit only by the porch light. "I hope you know I'm proud of you," he said. Grace didn't answer right away. For a long time, she had only wanted an apology. But now she realized what she wanted more was recognition. Acknowledgement that what she had endured had been real, that her pain hadn't been wasted, and hearing it from him meant more than she had expected. Months later, Richard made a decision that shocked the entire business world. He sold a portion of his empire, stepped down permanently, and invested in a foundation dedicated to education for underprivileged children. When a reporter asked why, Richard's answer was simple. "Because there's more to life than winning. There's building something that lasts." The oak tree stood taller now, its branches stretching wider, its roots deeper in the earth. Grace sometimes sat beneath it on warm evenings, watching Leo climb its lowest branches, his laughter echoing across the yard. Richard would sit beside her, neither of them speaking for a while. It wasn't romance, it wasn't the past. It was two people who had been broken by choices, one by betrayal, one by pride, now quietly mending. Richard Carter had built a fortune to escape the boy he once was. But in the end, it wasn't his empire that made him whole. It was a little boy with hazel eyes and a woman who refused to be silenced. Grace looked at Leo and then at Richard, and for the first time she didn't see her pain when she looked at him. She saw possibility. The truth is rarely easy, it cuts, it exposes. But it also frees even the ones who fought hardest to hide from it. Grace walked into that ballroom carrying the weight of every lie ever told about her. She walked out carrying only her son's hand. Because the truth doesn't just set you free. It teaches you who you are when the world finally sees you. The screen fades to black, leaving only the soft sound of Leo's laughter echoing. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away, let's talk about it. What would you have done if you were Grace or Evelyn? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If you believe the truth should always come out, hit that like button. And if you want more stories like this full of twists, heartbreak, and hope, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell. Sharing this video might just inspire someone who needs courage tonight. Go ahead, send it to a friend.